Hopwood. Where's Marion? Marion Hopwood is the president of the Vallejo chapter of Filipino American National Historical Society. And she brought some of our family boards here. We display these at different events. And then Grandmaster Michael Giron over here, another old-timer from the Stockton area who now calls Vallejo home. And everybody else is special. Okay. Oops. Oh. So, can I get the lights? So I created this slideshow based on the book, but based on growing up as a Filipino in Vallejo. You know, growing up, I knew we had a lot of Filipinos here, but when I went to college and took Asian American history, I read nothing about Filipinos in Vallejo. It was always Filipinos in Stockton, Filipinos in San Francisco, Filipinos in Hawaii, but never Filipinos in Vallejo. And I wondered why, and the reason why is because nobody ever wrote about it. And you know, Vallejo, people growing up in Vallejo as Filipinos, we didn't see our existence here as anything special. But when I was in college, it was kind of put in a context for me. And what really struck me in that Asian American history class at Sac State were these sepia-colored photographs of the men wearing their zoot suits and their hats, and it looked just like the photos I saw in our family photo albums. And that's when it hit me that my family, my father, has a history in the United States, and this is my history. But it's actually our history, because it's not just Filipino history, it's not Philippine history, it's Filipino-American history that dovetails with California history, United States history, and of course world history because of Mare Island over here. But Vallejo is a very, very unique place to be a Filipino. It's probably one of the most interesting, complex Filipino communities outside of the Philippines because of how old we are. You know, most people think of Daly City as a major Filipino community, and it is, but that's a relatively new Filipino community, what we call a post-65 community. But Vallejo is really one of the oldest Filipino communities on the West Coast. So here we go. So the magnet for Filipinos to come to Vallejo is Mare Island. Okay, so Mare Island was founded in 1854 by, and its first commander was Admiral Farragut. And it was just in its infancy when the Spanish-American War and the resulting Philippine-American War broke out in 1896 and then 1898 for the Spanish-American War that was then fought in the Philippines. And it was in 1898, actually May of 1898, when the ships that went to the Battle of Manila Bay left from Mare Island Naval Shipyard to go to Manila Bay. On the way to Manila Bay, they stopped in San Francisco to Presidio, and they picked up the troops, and they went to Manila Bay, where they very easily defeated the Spanish. And then, because of that defeat in May of 1898, it led to the Declaration of Independence of the Philippines by the Philippine rebel leader named Emilio Aguinaldo, and he did that on June 12, 1898. And that's why we celebrate June as Philippine Cultural Month here in the city of Vallejo, and why we have Pisa Sanayon every first Saturday of the year of June. So Vallejo is probably the only place in the whole United States that celebrates Philippine independence where you have a festival in eyesight of a place that was directly responsible for that Declaration of Independence in the Philippines. I mean, to me, that's profound and it's unique. What makes this celebration in Vallejo so much more meaningful than going to San Francisco and eating a bunch of lumpias in the South of Market, right? Over here, you can actually see where that history actually started from. So, but Mare Island is the magnet, and here's the surrender of the Spanish to Dewey's fleet. Now, after this war, many of the Filipino officers, naval officers that were stationed in the Philippines came back to Mare Island. And some of them brought back their nannies. One of those nannies was Marion Hopwood's grandmother, who came to Mare Island, and she was one of the first Filipinas to actually live on Mare Island as the nanny of, what's the name of the officer?
I'm sorry?
What was the name of the family that your mother, your grandmother worked for?
Lieutenant Commander Shetke, Naval Commander Shetke. He was stationed in the Philippines and got reassigned to Mare Island and brought my grandmother with him as his nanny.
Grandma Candida. And she was single, and she met her grandfather right there at Mare Island, where a lot of those Filipino men were working. So again, here's Emilio Aguinaldo declaring the Philippines independent on June 12, 1898, raising the first Philippine flag and declaring himself the president of the Philippines. Even though he declared independence in the Philippines and declared the Philippines an independent nation, the Americans did not recognize that Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, on February 4th, 1899, the Philippines and the United States went to war against each other. It was called the Philippine-American War. And many of those soldiers who fought against the Americans were using weapons that were outdated, but they were beating the Americans in hand-to-hand combat because they were using forms of Filipino martial arts, using sticks and bladed weapons. And we practice those arts here in Vallejo today. Grandmaster Michael practices his family system. I practice another system. But the Filipinos were able to fight in hand-to-hand combat and actually beat the Americans in guerrilla warfare fighting. There were black soldiers, what we call the Buffalo Soldiers, fighting in the Philippines at this time. And these were, some of them were former slaves or sons of former slaves, and most of them came from the southern part of the United States. And they were in these battalions called the Buffalo Battalions. And they were called Buffalo Soldiers not because of their black skin and their kinky hair. That's one myth that's been passed on. But it was during the American Indian Wars that the American Indians gave them the term Buffalo Soldiers. And the American Indians revered the buffaloes as a giver of life, as these humble, strong creatures. And it's because these Buffalo Soldiers that were assigned to watch over them treated them with dignity and as human beings. So they gave them that respect back and called them Buffalo Soldiers. But one of these Buffalo Soldiers was a man by the name of George Washington Carter. And George Washington Carter married a Filipino woman after the Philippine-American War. Her name was Maria Martinez. And they got married and he started a pig farm in Cavite in the Philippines, which is just north of Manila, or south of Manila. But the crocodiles, and we used to have these really ferocious big saltwater crocodiles in the Philippines. They're pretty much extinct now. Were eating their pigs. So in 1912, he moved his family to Vallejo when he got a job at Mare Island as a carpenter. They already had one daughter in the Philippines. But their first daughter, Alice, was born in Vallejo. I might be getting ahead of myself. But during the Philippine-American War, the United States, 250,000 Filipinos were killed. Philippines were saying it's more like 2 million. Because not only were people killed outright by the war, but they also died of disease and starvation. By 1901, the United States was rebuilding the Philippines in its own image. So they started a public works system with water, electricity, roads, sewers. They started a public health system, establishing American-style nursing schools. That's why you can't go anywhere, right? Anywhere in the United States without seeing Filipinos working in nursing homes and hospitals and medical clinics. But more importantly, they started an American public school system in the Philippines that was based on the American public school model, and they sent over 600 American teachers on the USS Thomas to spread themselves throughout the Philippines to teach this American public school system. So these kids in the Philippines, by 1901, starting in 1901, were learning the same thing that kids in America were learning. But more importantly, these teachers were teaching the Filipinos how to speak English. And that's why the Philippines is the third largest English literate nation in the world today. But in the United States, a lot of Americans were still confused about why the United States fought this war in the Philippines and what the heck is a Filipino and what do they look like. So in 1906, the United States appropriated $1 million to set up a Philippine village at the 1906 St. Louis World's Fair, or 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And they brought over 1,000 Filipino natives to inhabit those villages, and it was the biggest attraction at the St. Louis World's Fair, and it was the most popular attraction at World's Fair. So these are some artifacts that I have in my collection from that World's Fair. But again, it was just propaganda, because they wanted to show the American people that the United States needed to, as President McKinley said, civilize, Christianize, and educate the Filipinos because they were unfit for self-rule. So it was just to portray the Filipinos as these primitive, uncivilized people. So they had these native Filipinos come and pose next to the civilized Americans wearing their uncivilized, sorry.
You can probably turn off notifications.
I'll just, too late now. But to show to prove to the American people that, see, these Filipinos are so uncivilized, they don't even wear clothes. Yeah. The G-string that he's wearing is called a bahag. And many of the tribes in the north wore bahags as their traditional loincloths. They also had one of the tribes, the Igorot tribe, kill, cook, and eat a dog every day during the fair. So that stereotype that Filipinos eat dogs, you guys heard that? Yeah. It started here in the United States at the St. Louis World's Fair. But again, I can tell you, Filipinos, we do not eat dogs. Okay? We eat cats. No, we eat neither. We eat neither. But this dog eating was one of the most popular attractions at the World's Fair. But the St. Louis Women's Humane Society was so appalled by it that they lobbied the president of the fair to stop it, which they did. But not before a local entrepreneur wanted to capitalize on the popularity of the dog eating by creating a new sandwich, which was a sausage in a bun, and he called it the hot dog. True story. True story. In 1901, the United States government was sending primarily rich Philippine college students to the United States, to some of the best colleges, to get an American-style education. And then after they graduated, they were tasked with coming back to the Philippines to help build the government and the educational systems. We call these men pensionados. So in Filipino-American history, we refer to the waves of immigration. The first wave were the ones that came during the Galleon period from 1587 till 1815. So these Spanish galleons went from Manila, Philippines to Acapulco, Mexico, carrying goods and Filipino slaves as well, and went back and forth between the two Spanish colonies. But the second wave is the most important wave, especially here locally, because in 1906, the Hawaiian Sugarcane Planters Association went to the northern part of the Philippines and recruited 15 Ilocanos. Ilocanos are the people in the north. That's the language we speak. Remember, at this time, the United States has the Philippines as one of its territories because it bought the Philippines for $20 million from Spain in 1898 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. So they got the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Marianas Islands, but only Cuba was given its independence. But I think, Ken, you have Our Islands and Their People here, the big book. Yeah. It looks like that, but it talks about all the different colonies the United States bought in 1898. But anyways, because of that, the Filipinos were classified as American nationals, not Asian aliens. So there were no restrictions for us to come to the United States after 1898. As long as we can pay that boat fare, we can come to the United States. And so we call this the second wave of immigration. And it started in 1906 with these first 15 Filipinos, because from then on, Filipinos have been coming in large numbers, specifically for work and for family reunification. And these Filipinos that landed in Hawaii, they worked in the sugarcane and pineapple plantations, and we refer to them as sakaras, which means workers. And Hawaii has a very large and old Filipino population. And a lot of the old Filipino families there, they just call themselves Hawaiians because there's been so much intermixing. Most of those coming were single Filipino men between the ages of 16 and 22 years old. Many of them, like my father, were educated, but only up to a certain grade level. My father had a 6th grade education, but they could read, write, and speak English. For every 20 Filipino men, there was only 1 Filipino woman. Most of the women thought that their dads, their brothers, their uncles, their boyfriends, maybe even their husbands, would go to America, the mountain of gold, get rich, and then go back to the Philippines, and everyone would live happily ever after. But that really wasn't the case. We refer to these men who arrived during that time period from 1906 till about 1934 as manongs. Manong is an Ilocano word meaning older brother. It's a term of respect. Here's a picture of Maria Martinez Carter, who was brought to Vallejo in 1912 with her husband, George Washington Carter. And they had their first daughter in Vallejo, born in Vallejo in 1915. And her name was Alice. So the first Filipino born in Vallejo was half Filipino and half African American. And she was born on the 300 block of Florida Street in their house. This is my Uncle Clemente, who came to America in 1926 through Hawaii. He spoke very, very good English, so the Hawaiian Sugarcane Planters Association used him to interpret for the Ilocanos that they were hiring to work in their plantations. And because of that, he was able to earn more money. And he sent money back home to the Philippines so that 4 of his brothers could come back, or 3 of his brothers could come to America to join him. One of them was my Uncle Leon, who actually settled in the Seattle area. The other one was my Uncle Modesto, whose son Leo is here. Leo, raise your hand. Leo. So believe it or not, Leo is like the patriarch of our family now, because everybody else is gone. And then my father, Nazario, who was 20 years old when he arrived in America in 1926. The same year as Dorothy Herder. Where's Dorothy? There's Dorothy. So Dorothy was only 2 years old. My dad was 20 years old. But he could read, write, and speak English. And again, that's pretty typical of the Filipinos arriving during this time period. And when the Filipinos went to look for work, the vast majority of them worked as migrant farm workers or stoop labor, working in the fields for 10 cents an hour or $1 a day. Now, mind you, these early Filipino manongs did not come from the boat to Vallejo. They made their way to Vallejo via these other jobs. They didn't work in the fields. They went up to Alaska, where they worked in the Alaskan canneries. They call themselves Alascaros. So like Hawaii, Alaska has a very large and old Filipino population that is intermixed with the native Alaskan Eskimo population. The third type of job were in the cities. When my father arrived in San Francisco, he worked in a battery factory, then he worked in a restaurant as a busboy, cook, dishwasher, all of that. And then he found his way to Vallejo. This is a picture of Lorenzo Dizon, and this picture is in my book. And Lorenzo Dizon is wearing his chauffeur outfit. He was a chauffeur for Mary Pickford. All you old people know who Mary Pickford is, right? She was one of the top Hollywood movie stars in the golden days of Hollywood in the 1930s. And a lot of these Hollywood movie stars and rich people love to have Filipinos as their houseboys or their chauffeurs or their butlers, and it's because the Filipino men spoke good English. They didn't have to worry about their immigration status, and Filipinos tend to be very caring people and hard workers. Lorenzo Dizon eventually did move to Vallejo. The fourth type of job they worked were in the shipyards, and of course, what do we have here in Vallejo? Mare Island Naval Shipyard. So, like my father and my uncles, they started out in doing these other types of works, and then when Mare Island was starting to hire laborers, they found out, and many of these Filipino men came to Vallejo to work at Mare Island. Around the wartime, there were probably about 2,000 or 3,000 Filipinos already working at Mare Island. My Uncle Modesto is right there. And this picture was taken in 1932. So
Was
by
your dad
1932,
here yet?
What's that?
Was your dad here yet?
Yes, my dad and my two uncles were already working at Mare Island in 1932. And I actually got this picture from our historical society in Seattle.
Huh.
I'd never seen this picture until I went up to Seattle and found it. But like I said, it was a bachelor society. The Filipino men loved to wear their finest suits and go out and socialize. But because there were so few places to socialize, they socialized in exclusive clubs. This is a picture of my father and some uncles going out to Stockton. Stockton was a favorite place for the Filipinos to go and butcher a goat or butcher pigs. They would meet up with their relatives or friends that were working in the fields. And what the Filipino men in Vallejo did is they would bring knives and farming implements that they made in the shops here in Mare Island and swap them with vegetables and other products from the Delta, from Stockton. Because the Filipinos that worked in the shops here, they had access to the best metals and machine shops. So they would make the asparagus knives and the short hoes and cooking knives, and that's how they would just barter. And actually I have some of those implements on display at the Mare Island Museum. This is a picture of my father wearing his Masonic Lodge regalia. And my father was a member of one of the Masonic organizations called Legionarios del Trabajo. Michael Jerome's father was a member of the Stockton Lodge, but Vallejo had a very large lodge as well. My father was a worshipful master. I just love those titles, worshipful master. But the lodges were a place where the Filipino men who in their real life had menial jobs were members of, and they practiced civic responsibility, they raised money, they practiced their leadership skills, they held fundraisers, the politicians would go to them when they needed support for elections. It was like a secret society in a sense as well. It was very closed, it was very ritualistic. But it was something that the men, once they became a member of, they were members for the rest of their lives. When my father passed away at 101 years old, he was the oldest member of this lodge up to that time.
Is it still in existence?
It is. I'm not sure where they're meeting in Vallejo, but I know that they're still in existence. The main headquarters is in Stockton. They're still meeting there, right? The Gohori Lodge, they're still meeting there. But they had lodges from San Diego to Seattle, and they would have these annual big galas, usually in Stockton or one of the big cities. And I remember my dad would go to these big conventions every year. But there was another one of the fraternities in San Francisco called Gran Oriente. And because of these organizations were 501c3s, they can buy and own property. At this time, Filipinos couldn't own property. We couldn't own a business because in 1932 they passed laws against Filipinos that made it illegal for us to become citizens. We couldn't own land, we couldn't own a business, we couldn't live in white residential neighborhoods, and we couldn't marry white people in California. But if you had a church or you had an organization like the fraternities, they can buy land and own property. And I know the Legionarios probably own millions of dollars worth of land in the Central Valley. Gran Oriente, they bought an apartment building in what's now South Beach in San Francisco. And it's worth millions and millions of dollars right now. One of the first things the Filipino men did when they arrived in America was have their photo taken at a professional photo studio wearing sometimes borrowed suits, and then they would send these photos back to the Philippines to the relatives so that the relatives would think that they were rich here in America, right? Living up to that American dream. But like I said earlier, they needed the nice suits to go out on the weekend and socialize. And those of you who have Filipino friends know that Filipinos love to party. We love to karaoke, we love to eat, we love to go to Catchy Creek. We just love to have fun. But the Filipino men who were mainly bachelors missed their female friends and companionship, not only in the Philippines, but here in the United States, because there were so few of them. So they went to places called taxi dance halls. And a taxi dance hall was a nightclub where they can dance with a white woman for one dance lasting from 1 to 3 minutes. Okay, remember, they worked in the hot sun for that dime, yet they would blow their whole week's paycheck in one night to be with these women. And they did that because they were lonely. They missed their women folk back in the Philippines. Sometimes they dated white women here in America. This is Richard and Darlene Cantorna. Some of you old-timers might remember. Darlene was an artist here in Vallejo as well. They lived in South Vallejo. She was a Rosie the Riveter. He was in the U.S. Army, in the 1st Filipino Infantry Battalion. They've both since passed away. And then that's my father, but that's not my mother. What's that woman's name again?
Frances Rappanan.
Frances Rappanan. Well, you know, these men were men.
Right.
But if you think about African American history, what would happen if a white man was seen dating a white woman in America in the 1930s? Not good. He would get lynched. Sometimes they would get killed. They would get driven out of towns. Well, the same attitudes were directed towards Filipinos here on the West Coast. And you start seeing signs like positively no Filipinos allowed, or we do not serve Filipinos, or no Filipinos or dogs allowed. This sign was painted in a hotel on the staircase in Stockton in 1929. So this started the anti-Filipino movement of the late 1920s until the end of World War II. But think about what was going on economically in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. It was a Great Depression. Whenever the economy is bad, society and government in particular like to blame the newest immigrants, and at that time was the Filipinos. So sometimes history has a way of repeating itself. Newspaper reports were scapegoating Filipinos as taking jobs away from white Americans, spreading venereal diseases, and being an economic burden on society. Again, they were just being scapegoated. This is Filipinos threatened in Turlock, which is a small town in the valley. Night Riders armed with clubs order hasty exodus. The Night Riders were the Ku Klux Klan, and they did target Filipinos. One Filipino by the name of Furman Tobera was shot and killed after the Watsonville riots in 1930 as he slept in his bunkhouse. But all of that changed even more dramatically, like I said, in 1932, when many of those anti-Filipino laws were passed. Finally, in 1935, the Tidings-McDuffie Act was passed, which changed our Filipino status from American nationals to Asian aliens. And as Asian aliens, they put a quota of 50 Filipinos per year allowed to immigrate to the United States. So that ended the second wave of immigration. This is a wedding reception at the San Pablo Lodge on Georgia Street. And Mr. and Mrs. Benoya, Mrs. Benoya was white. Mr. Benoya, of course, is Filipino. They went to Washington State to get married. They came back to Vallejo to have their wedding reception. So there were 12 states where it was illegal for Filipinos to marry whites, California being one of them. The third wave is what I call the naval era, or the World War II era. Pearl Harbor was bombed in December of 1941. 6 hours later, Japan invaded the Philippines. So thousands upon thousands of Filipinos here in the United States already wanted to free their homeland from the Japanese, but also wanted to prove their loyalty to their new adopted country. The United States Army was able to form 2 all-Filipino volunteer battalions, the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Battalions. Grandmaster Michael Giron's father fought valiantly was it the 1st or 2nd?
Second.
The 2nd Filipino Infantry Battalion, and actually taught the other soldiers how to fight with a Philippine bolo. And he was awarded the bronze medal because of that, or the Bronze Star, which you saw in the paper a couple of weeks ago. But these were the men that paved the way back for MacArthur's return to the Philippines by doing radio communications and just clearing out some of the strongholds of the Japanese. They were trained at Camp San Luis Obispo on the Central Coast. But the vast majorities who joined could only get into the U.S. Navy, like my father. He was already working at Mare Island, and when he joined, he was immediately sent to steward school in San Diego, and then was assigned to an officer in Pearl Harbor. So Filipinos and blacks were the only two races of people that were assigned as stewards. And it stayed that way till about 1970. But the Filipinos who joined the U.S. Navy knew that by doing so, they would eventually be able to become U.S. citizens, and as U.S. citizens, they would be able to have better lives for themselves and for their families. So they felt it was a sacrifice that they were willing to make. These Filipino stewards worked in the galleys or the kitchens, or they worked for the officers and cleaned their cabins, shined their shoes, walked their dogs, all menial jobs. And it didn't matter whether the Filipino was educated or not. That was the only job he could get in the U.S. Navy. That's why so many Filipino men are good cooks, because they learn how to cook in the Navy. This is a picture of the Mabuhay restaurant on Sonoma Boulevard near Lemon Street. You can imagine how excited these two Filipino sailors were to come to this place called Vallejo and find a Filipino restaurant that had a whole menu written on the front of the restaurant. This was about 1940, 44, 45. Today it's La Rosa's Mexican Market in Taqueria. So it's still, the building is still there today. This is my father, who was a steward first class. My father served 4 years in the U.S. Navy. Remember, he was born in 1906. He came to America in 1926. He joined the U.S. Navy in 1942. He did his 4 years until 1946. So how old is he in 1946? 40 years old. When he went to re-enlist in the Navy, they told him he was too old. So instead of re-enlisting in the Navy, he came back to work at Mare Island. So he'd been working at Mare Island continuously from 1932 until 1974 when he retired, except for the 4 years that he served in the U.S. Navy. And that's important to note because a lot of these men who served in the U.S. Military, whether it's in the Navy or the Army, by the time the war ended, the United States had now lifted some of those anti-Filipino laws. So now Filipinos can become U.S. citizens. They had to take a test. They can own property if somebody would sell it to them. But more importantly, the United States raised the quota from 50 per year to 100 per year, but they passed something called the War Brides Act. So men like my father, who served for the U.S. military, could now go back to the Philippines, find a bride, and bring them to the United States as non-quota immigrants, meaning there were no limits or quotas on the number of brides that could be brought to the United States. And here in Vallejo, we had a large number of single Filipino men with good jobs at Mare Island. In the Philippines, they had a large number of single Filipino women wanting to come to America. So there was a lot of matchmaking going on. In my father's fraternity, they had a sister sorority, which they called the Women's Auxiliary. So the women in the Women's Auxiliary started matchmaking their friends and their relatives in the Philippines with these single men here in Vallejo. And Mrs. Ancheta, Consuelo Ancheta, did a lot of the matchmaking here in Vallejo. So a lot of those families in South Vallejo were matchmade by my, I call it my Auntie Conching, Ancheta. My mother and father included. My father started writing to my mother by letters, snail mail, in 1950-57. They corresponded for 2 years. They fell in love through the mail, through pictures. My father proposed to my mother through the mail. She replied back through the mail. And then he flew to the Philippines in 1959 to marry her sight unseen. My father was... In 1959, my father was 53 years old, and my mother was 22 years old. About a 30-year age difference. But that was very typical of the old Filipino families here in Vallejo. Pretty much in Stockton as well, right? Yeah. Because, again, there weren't a lot of Filipino women for them to choose from, and many of the men wanted to marry Filipino women as well. So we can thank the War Brides Act for that. And because Vallejo had such a large Filipino population already of men who had jobs, many of them came to Vallejo and settled here in Vallejo. In 1946, this is that act that changed the immigration quotas from 50 years to 100 per year immigration quotas. This is a picture of my Uncle Clemente's wife and their 3 children at the Carquinez Heights housing project in South Vallejo. So once you have all these wives in Vallejo, you have children. You have children, you have families. You have families, you have the beginning of the Filipino community as we know it today. So the Filipino community, although we had families in Vallejo before the war, there weren't a whole lot. But it was after the war that you start having all the baby boomer kids. So a lot of these kids in this photo are still around today. We still hang out together. They're members of our historical society. We're just trying to keep our family histories alive. And the neighborhoods that the Filipinos lived in at this time were mainly here, St. Vincent's Hill and South Vallejo. Those were the 2 biggest pockets of Filipino neighborhoods in Vallejo. This is the original site of the Filipino Community Center in South Vallejo near Grant and Cherry Street. They eventually sold this lot before building a community center there, and they bought the building at the 800 block of Sonoma Boulevard, where the building is still today. That building, I was just there yesterday to pick up signs for Pisa Sanayon. That building was partially paid for by money that was raised in the community. And one of the biggest fundraisers was a woman named Lucy Dizon, the sister of Lorenzo Dizon. And Lucy was a brothel and gambling house owner on Georgia Street. And she made a lot of money. She was undoubtedly probably one of the richest women in Solano County, self-made rich woman, not because of a husband, but because of her own business acumen. And she gave a lot of money to the community. She and Louis Lopez, and we have descendants of Louis Lopez here in the room. Lisa, raise your hand. And so those two, Louis Lopez, he was like the godfather of the Filipino community. I mean, literally the godfather. He had a establishment here on Georgia Street, and the Filipino community was in the basement of his building at one time. But between Louis and Lucy Dizon, they raised a lot of money for the Filipino community, helped fund that building that's in South Vallejo. Lucy owned the Midway Horse Farm at the corner of Benicia Road and Columbus Parkway. Imagine that, a Filipina owning a horse farm in the 1940s and 50s. And there's pictures of her and her husband and their friends in the book, and she looks like a movie star. She looks like a movie star. She loved to wear fancy clothes. And when the Philippines was given its independence on July 4th, 1946, she chartered a plane and put about a dozen of her best friends on that plane, including Louis Lopez, and flew them to the Philippines for the inaugural ceremonies for the independence of the Philippines. That's how rich she was. Unfortunately, she died very poor by herself with a bunch of cats in a little shack behind the Filipino community.
What happened?
Just bad relationships, men who took advantage of her kindness and her money. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of these days I need to write that whole story about her, because that's a really interesting story. I even tried to interview her Greek bodyguard when I was doing the book, but he would not give up any stories. The Greeks are good people, very loyal. Tina's from an old Greek family here in town. But yeah, he would not give up any stories about Lucy. This is a picture of a citizenship class. I believe this was at the Veterans Memorial Building. So the Filipinos, anyone who wanted to become a citizen had to take a citizen class to pass the test questions. So this brings us up to the fourth wave. So the quota is 100 per year. We have Filipino families now in Vallejo because of the War Brides Act. But in 1965, thanks to Ted Kennedy, the United States Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And what it did is it equalized the quotas of immigrants from all the countries around the world not just having favorable quotas for the European nations, but all nations. So now the quota becomes 20,000 Filipinos per year allowed to come to the United States. And in the Philippines, what do they call it? What do they call it in the Philippines? They call it the brain drain, because their most educated Filipinos were now coming to the United States to find better opportunities. But today we call them the post-65 generation. And the majority of Filipinos in the United States today are post-65ers. And this photo actually isn't a family coming to the United States for the first time with all the hopes and dreams of America. This is our family going to the Philippines on vacation in 1967. and that's me right there, probably about the age that I was going to story time with Miss Julie over here. But here's the Hart-Celler Act in 1965 that is otherwise known as the Immigration and Nationality Act. And it was signed there at Ellis Island in New York City. A vast majority of those initially coming in 1965 were Filipino nurses. Filipino nurses. And why? Because the Philippines, or the United States, had established these American nursing schools in the Philippines. And the United States was having a nursing shortage due to the Vietnam War. So they started recruiting Filipino nurses and medical personnel to the United States. Also, you start having more educated professional Filipinos moving to Vallejo, like Luisa G. Evangelista. Who remembers the Luisa G. Evangelista store across from City Park at the corner of Sacramento and Louisiana Street? She was probably one of our most well-known Filipino businesswomen. Her store was probably only a quarter of this space here, but it sold everything from dried fish to sacks of rice to Filipino furniture. She also had another store. Oh, there's her family right there. She also had another store on 6th Street in San Francisco, and she had the exclusive contract with the U.S. Navy to provide Philippine goods for all the commissaries in California. So, and they were the first Filipino family to buy a house in Green Valley. In Vallejo, if you grow up in Vallejo and you make it big in Vallejo, you buy property and move to Green Valley. And they were the first ones to do that. And today, we have Filipino markets and stores all around Vallejo, the biggest one being Seafood City. And of course, in East Vallejo, we have Island Pacific. And every year, we celebrate our Philippine heritage with Pista Sanayon. And it's always at the Vallejo waterfront, the first Saturday of every June. I call it a Vallejo festival. It just happens to be Filipino. The entertainment crosses all cultures and genres. Yes, we have Philippine dances, but we have hip hop, we have jazz, we have R&B, we have our martial arts schools performing. And this year we're celebrating our 10th anniversary of our Filipino martial arts tournament that Grandmaster Michael Juron and I have been putting on. And we were the first ones to bring a Filipino martial arts tournament to a major Filipino festival. And now other festivals are following suit. So if you have a chance, come on out. It's only about 3 weeks away. We're going to have great entertainment. Our headliner this year is CRSB, the duo who are graduates from Jesse Bethel High School, and now they're talking the Island Reggae chart, so they're going to be there, along with a bunch of other acts. Anyone know who this woman is? Natalie Coughlin. Natalie Coughlin was born and raised in Vallejo. She's the most decorated female American Olympic athlete. And the man here in this photo, crowning the queen, is Larry Acera. Larry, at the age of 23 years old, was the first Filipino elected as city council in Vallejo. He did 4 years, and then he went on to win a seat on the County Board of Supervisors, still the only Filipino ever to serve on the County Board of Supervisors. But he is crowning a queen in this photo, Nancy Lozano, who also went on to some fame herself. She became a porn star named Kumisha Amado. So Filipinos, and my cousin Leo knows that very well. But Filipinos are no different than anyone else. We're no different than anyone else.
How is?
This is little Gabby Wilson, who's now known as Her. She won several Grammys at the last Grammy Awards. Her mother, Agnes, worked with me at Kaiser. And then this was our last city council, where we had 4 Filipinos in city council. And we had 3 Filipinos in city council. We had Rosanna, Bob Sampayan, and Jess Malangapo. Today, Bob is the mayor, and we got Hermes Sunga back on the city council. So, like I said, Vallejo is probably one of the most empowered Filipino cities in the United States, or outside of the Philippines, because we're so politically empowered with people on the school board as well as the city council. And I want to end with this slide, what I call the model. This is a picture of my father on the far left, my Uncle Clemente and my Uncle Modesto. This was at my Uncle Clemente's 92nd birthday party about 20 or so years ago. And of course, they've all since passed away. My Uncle Clemente was the first to go, then my Uncle Modesto, and about 10 years ago, my father passed away at almost 102 years old. But I call them our heroes because these were the Filipinos that ventured across that vast Pacific Ocean, not knowing what they were going to encounter here in the United States, and endured and persevered through all kinds of adversity, from tough jobs, backbreaking work, hostile communities, and racist laws. But because of them and their perseverance, we have the Filipino community as we know it today in Vallejo and throughout the United States. So that's it. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, and other Filipinos in the room, you're welcome to chime in as well. Any questions or comments?
Weren't all Asians subjected to the same?
Yes. All Asians were subjected to these anti-immigrant laws starting in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah. And then in 1912, the Gentleman's Agreement, which targeted the Japanese. And then finally in 1924, when all the Asians were under these racist laws, except for the Filipinos. But it finally caught up to the Filipinos in 1934. And it was primarily because of the Great Depression. You know. Yes?
I'm an archivist, so I'm always really, the big thing I do is like try to figure out what's going on in the background of pictures. So the picture of Truman in 1948, do you know who the people were behind him?
No, but I can find out.
Yeah.
I can find out.
I mean, who got that law? Who got it passed?
Senator Seller.
Yeah. And just why?
In 1946, well, it was after World War II, and the United States had 64 allied nations that fought along with them during World War II, including the Philippines. And that's why the Philippines was part of that Seller Act, and was allowed to have a token 100 per year immigration quota.
Where was Seller from?
I'm not sure what state he was from.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was born quite some time ago and raised in New York. And I went only to private schools, so I can't speak of what happened in public schools. But I was taught, number one, that the Filipinos had been promised their freedom at some indeterminate age. I was taught this before the war began, about 1939, 1940.
Yes.
I had a friend who talked about the war that you spoke of between the United States and the Philippines, but he called it the Moro insurrection.
Some of the history books will refer to it as an insurrection, but it really was an all-out war.
Yeah, I mean, please understand, I'm speaking about the East Coast now.
Yeah. Well, it was all over the place. They call it insurrection.
No, that's the one misconception, is that communication between the West Coast and the East Coast was very, very slow and changed around very dramatically in the translation movement. I'm simply going through these, and during the Second World War, the Filipinos were praised on the East Coast for their activity against the Japanese after Bataan fell.
What
Just
was
a
the
little bit
popular?
of-
Was there a really large population
I-
of Filipinos in the East? Most
No,
No.
there
wasn't.
weren't
There weren't
many.
very many.
And of course,
That,
Uh,
that
what-
Promise Independence you were talking about was the Tidings McDuffie Act, because its intent was to give the Philippines, this is 1935, their intent was to give the Philippines their independence from the United States.
yeah,
They were going to give them 10 years to become their own independent, self-governed nation. But in doing so, it was really disguised as a immigration restriction act, because it changed their immigration status from American nationals to Asian aliens. And they would have got their independence. Well, what happened was World War II interrupted that 10-year time period. So they actually got it a little bit later, but only because of the war.
mm-hmm.
Steve?
Two questions. So can you talk about the distinction between an American national and a U.S. citizen?
They had just about all the rights of a U.S. citizen, except they could not vote.
And then the other question I have is, could you tell us a little bit about Carlos Bolasan, and we celebrate Carlos Bolasan Day here in Vallejo. What influence did he have on the Filipino community, and did he have any connection to Vallejo?
Well, the connection of Carlos Bulasan to Vallejo is our mayor, that's his grand uncle.
Really?
Carlos Bulasan was the first Filipino to publish, to have books published here in the United States about the Filipino-American experience. He was like my father and like Michael Jerome's father, who came in the 1920s. He was very active with the labor movement and with labor leader activists and some of the communist activities that they were doing. He wrote his seminal autobiography called America is in the Heart, which is required reading for all Asian American studies and ethnic studies classes. And it's a story of where he came from a part of the Philippines called Pangasinan, to his journey to America and what he experienced here in the United States as a Filipino immigrant, trying to find work, trying to find love. And like I said, his book, you should have it here, was very instrumental in getting young college students to understand that experience, because I don't think there's been another book that even equals his way of storytelling and really portraying how hard it was for people of my father's generation to make it here in the United States. And again, Vallejo was a little different. It was a little different because the Filipinos working at Mare Island had living wage jobs. There was not a competition here in Vallejo for jobs. So Vallejo was a little different, and Vallejo's always been a little different because of the jobs that really led to economic equality in town. We didn't have a lot of the really, really harsh race riots. I'm not saying that we didn't. Vallejo was still segregated, but it wasn't as bad as like in the Deep South where the allegations that people of color, blacks or whatever, were taking jobs from white Americans, or the interracial dating. It was bad here in Vallejo, but it wasn't as bad as in other places.
Did the Ku Klux Klan actually come? Were they in Vallejo? Or just
I don't know. Maybe
you
someone
mentioned
older than me would know if the Klan was in
they
Vallejo.
were riding. I mean, they were here.
I know they were here,
they
but
were-
I don't know if they targeted Filipinos in Vallejo.
Mm.
I haven't heard any of those stories. Yeah.
One of the things that's most interesting to me about immigration is that the people who go to a new place preserve the culture from where they came from at the time. So people who came here from the Philippines in the 1920s would preserve the 1920s version of what Philippine culture was like. And then, as the decades go on and Philippine culture itself goes off in a different direction, you start getting new migrants coming in that have new versions of the culture coming in over time. How well do you think the Philippine community here is at integrating the 1920s version of Filipino culture with the 1940s version and the 1960s versus people who are still coming in
That's a
now?
good point, and that's why we founded the Filipino American National Historical Society Vallejo chapter, and we have presentations like this. We have our exhibit at the Mare Island Museum. It's to remind people that we had a culture and a history here in Vallejo that dates back to the 1920s. In most cultures, the transmitter of culture is the mother. And because we didn't have a lot of females here, we didn't have widespread like Filipino dance troops or things like that. But the one thing that was brought here that was a big part of our culture was the food. And the initial Filipino families in Vallejo came from the north. So a lot of that Filipino food was northern Filipino food. Some very deep Ilocano dishes that were served and prepared here in Vallejo. And there were no restaurants. Well, there weren't restaurants that served some of the deep Filipino foods. There were some restaurants like the Philippine Village on George Street that served the traditional Filipino foods like lumpia and pancit and chicken adobo, things like that. But some of the Filipino dishes, you couldn't get them at restaurants. Even today, you don't see them at restaurants. Although Kegalani's over at the corner of Tennessee and Admiral Callahan serves a very deep Ilocano dish called pinapaitan. It's made with some very interesting spices. Let's put it that way. But I applauded the chef over there for bringing this kind of dish to the masses.
Yes, this may have already been asked, but I'm curious, what was the immigration process at that time, and how did they determine which 100 was qualified to come?
Well, I know what the immigration process is now. You have to file a petition with the embassy in the Philippines, and they decide who gets to come in based on qualifications or also based on whether they will be supported here in the United States. So if I want a relative to come to the United States, I petition for them, but I have to prove that while they're getting getting settled in the United States, that they're not going to be a burden on society, that I am signing an affidavit of support to show that my family or myself would be able to support them until they're economically available to do that. So there's a number of factors.
I was wondering, as you know, a lot of my relatives went to Southern California. I have some in Seattle area, some in South.
Another, what, your third generation?
Yeah.
Third generation.
Is on the West Coast, where was the largest concentration of Filipino immigrants?
The largest concentration was in Stockton.
Okay.
Was in Stockton. And Stockton has a historic Manila town designated around El Dorado Street and underneath that highway. Los Angeles probably had the second biggest one, and then probably after that it would be Seattle and San Francisco. Seattle's was what they call the International District, and San Francisco had a large one along Kearny Street. But most of these historic Filipino towns don't have a lot of Filipinos living in them anymore. Filipinos have moved out to the suburbs or moved out to the nicer neighborhoods. They're just remnants of the places or the buildings that these Filipino businesses once stood, including here in downtown Vallejo. I mean, even in this spot here, this was where the Georgian Hotel was located, and lots of Filipino families live in the Georgian Hotel right here on this spot. In the parking lot over here is where the Filipino Methodist Church was first established. And the Filipino Methodist Church was started because the Catholic Church, St. Vincent's, wouldn't let Filipinos become members.
Really?
Because there was still that racism towards people of color, even though the majority of Filipinos were Catholic. So the Filipino families in town wanted their children to learn about the Bible, so they went to San Francisco and they recruited a pastor, a United Methodist pastor, Pastor Marquez, to start a Bible study on Saturday mornings for the kids. And after a while, the parents got into it as well, and they convinced Pastor Marquez to move to Vallejo, and they started the Filipino Methodist Church. Now, so some of these old Filipino communities, the first Filipino churches were not Catholic. they were non-Catholic churches. What was the church in Stockton where the Inosanto family were very active?
Trinity Presbyterian.
Trinity Presbyterian Church.
Wow.
Yeah. It's because the Catholic churches weren't real welcoming of the Filipinos prior to World War II and immediately afterwards. That's one of the reasons why you have the St. Bertrand Church Chapel in South Vallejo, because that's where the Filipino community lived. And instead of having the Filipino Catholics come all the way and intermix over here at St. Vincent's, they just kept them segregated over there in South Vallejo at St. Bertrand Church.
Do you talk about that in the book at all? About
Well, you know,
because
a picture can tell 1,000 words. I can't, you know, each picture has a story behind it. If I would have told the story about Larry Acera and the porn star, no, that would take a whole chapter.
Right.
But every picture has, you know, can tell 1,000
Well, that's
words.
easy because I live in South Vallejo and pass by St. Bertrand's frequently and had no idea
Why that church is.
why it's there, because it's totally excommunicated from the rest of the parish. They, you know, there's no mention. They're still surviving on a shoestring, I guess. They I don't know if they even have a.
I don't know. I know that the Samoan masses are held there.
Yeah, I mean,
Different
I've been
totally
to that.
and they're not. They don't have any publicity. Nothing said about them.
Yeah, you know, Vallejo doesn't really have any real Filipino landmarks per se, except for maybe the Filipino community in South Vallejo. We do have a couple of Philippine War artifacts on Mare Island, the old administration building. There's two cannons out front that were taken during the Philippine-American War in 1901 from Cavite. I keep on saying I'm going to go there one night and you know, recover them for the Filipino community and put one in front of the Filipino Community Center and one in front of my house. I know Lennar Mare Island probably would not be very happy with me, because they know I got my eyes on those cannons anyway.
Your display at Mare Island, is that permanent, or that was when you did the?
It's a permanent exhibit. We're going to keep on adding to it. What we're trying to do is we want to try to capture the names of every Filipino that worked at Mare Island.
Ambitious project.
It's an ambitious project. We've got, how many names do we have on there?
I'm sorry?
How many names do we have on our exhibit at Mare Island?
How about 357?
So we know that that's just scratching the surface. That's just scratching. And that's people who worked there from the very beginning, from the turn of the century, till it closed in 1996. So we know we're just scratching the surface. But we want to honor all of those Filipinos and their families for the service they gave to the United States by working on Mare Island. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Oh, one more in the back. Okay, Patrice. My friend Kate, she's going to be running. She's a candidate for Solano County Supervisor in 2020.
Thank you. So every time I see your presentation,
Stand
I
up.
learn more.
Stand up. Stand up.
Every time I see your presentation, I learn more. So thank you for doing this. And your question, that last question just ties into what I was going to ask was, are you still on an information gathering?
Always.
journey? Okay.
Always. Because we know that there's still some hidden history out there. Matter of fact, when we debuted our exhibit at Mare Island, there was some people who came there, and you remember they told us about a church in Vallejo that was specifically for interracial couples, Filipino couples married, Filipino men married to Caucasian women, and that was the first time I had ever heard of that. So there's still these little historical tidbits that we're pulling out of the woodwork, and we know that there's about 12 Filipinos buried at the Mare Island Historic Cemetery. So we want to try to find out a story about them as well. But we really need to start collecting history of Filipinos who came post-65, because post-65, that's 40 years ago, 50 years ago. That's already history, and some of these that came in 1965, they're gone or they're getting old as well. But they are the ones who really brought the Filipino community in Vallejo to economic and social prominence, because they are the ones that had money, had the means. They bought houses in the newer neighborhoods. They opened up businesses. They populated our hospitals and other professional jobs. So we need to start collecting those histories as well. And the Vallejo schools are doing a great job in keeping our culture alive. They teach 3 levels of Filipino Tagalog classes, which are transferable as foreign language units. So not very many school districts have that, and I think it's great that here in Vallejo that they do that. I know when I graduated from Hogan in 1979, there were 10 Filipinos in my graduating class, and I would have never thought that they would have Tagalog classes, let alone Filipino principals and teachers, because we never had that growing up. So Vallejo has changed a great deal since I was growing up. Springs Road, there were no Filipino businesses on Springs Road, right? And then all of a sudden in the 1980s, bam, Filipinos, Springs Road is like one of the Filipino economic strip malls, basically. But growing up there, I would have never guessed that Springs Road would be that way.
You guys lived out in East Vallejo, didn't you?
Yeah, lived about 2 blocks from the Dairy Cow.
Oh, we on Vervaez?
On Vervaez.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brenda,
Hi,
thanks for coming.
thank you for all that you've done and contributed in our community. And I would like to say over the many years that I've been here, which is 35.
Oh, you're a newcomer.
I'm still a newcomer. Thank you. You know this, right? But we've had a lot of the Filipino community that has contributed to the society.
Particularly Sister Cities, it's one.
Right, through Sister Cities, which I've been a very active part of, and there's other members in the room that have also played a big role in that. But I would like to commend you and others like Pete Ray, who's no longer here, who has a lot of history in the Filipino community, and what they've done. One of my favorite entities about the Filipino community is the food. I love the Filipino food and my family as well. And so I'm looking forward to seeing some more very positive things, as a result of the contributions that you not only made in the past, but also in the future. And I want to thank you for what you did with helping us and assisting with fighting back. I remember articles that you wrote many years ago, which helped to get a grant, $14 million for the city of Vallejo for fighting back, which is still here and still very active. And you touched so many lives.
Well, thank you.
When you did.
True.
People always ask me, what's the best Filipino restaurant in Vallejo? I think it's Andrea's.
Oh, I thought Andrea's is closed.
No, Andrea's is not closed. What do you guys? What other people think?
3Js.
What? 3Js? 3Js?
Order food.
What's that?
You just order food right there and pick out what you want.
Which one?
3Js are fine.
Oh, 3Js in North Vallejo. Phil House. Phil House is good food over by seafood by Island Pacific.
That's right.
Keolani's, like I told you earlier, is more
What's
fusion Hawaiian Filipino food.
Where is the one that you were talking about? Usually unavailable.
Keolani's.
That's Keolani's.
Keolani's has the old. It's connected to the old Hojo's.
Oh, okay.
Across from Jack in the Box and the car wash.
Okay.
On Admiral Callahan.
Not by Riley's.
No.
Not the one the Hawaiian.
No. Keolani, you're thinking of L&L.
Yeah.
Not L&L.
And don't forget the senoritas.
Senoritas, Vallejo's favorite. Favorite. We got some in the back. I call that Filipino crack.
You get a party of any size, and eventually get to the point where somebody brings a box of senorita bread.
Yeah, or meetings. And know that when you go to a Filipino's house and they offer you food, you have to accept it. You can't say no. It's very disrespectful. It doesn't matter if you just came back from a smorgasbord beforehand. You got to taste their food. And when Filipinos say we're going to have just finger foods and appetizers, you're going to have a whole pig and a whole layout. We don't know what finger foods are, or just hors d'oeuvres. And if you go to a Filipino party, you have to take some food home.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Okay. You must take. Don't feel embarrassed. No, it's necessary, and it makes the host feel proud that they prepared enough food or bought enough food that people get to take food home. So that's normal and it's accepted. So don't feel bashful about taking food home. Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Neil. Noah, another commissioner, would you like to mention our next program is coming up?
Yeah. You have no part
I'll have a hard time, and I can't get them at that age, I can't get over them.
You got one of those.
It's about right. He's a professional. Oh, to make money? I think it's. I used to work people
Yeah, so, well, he's saying 100. No, you're right. No, it's $1,000. $1,000.
I used to quote that to people for like a low budget production. Higher end is $3,000. You know, they're like a Canberra stuff. Yeah, but it really depends. I mean, we can have a really long discussion because I get that question asked. And I've made feature length
Well, nowadays, with all the technology, you do a lot. Yeah, I know there's film festivals out there. They're not going to look like a $10,000 a minute one, but they're going to look. You got a picture with Bert? She keeps sending us Bert. Hey, check with, he's got a picture with Kamisha Amato. We got, I know, we're in the show. We should get her back to Vallejo. Probably Vegas. That's all in Vegas, right? Yeah. So we're using. Hey, Robert, I didn't see you. Were you back here? I see you back there. What? Hi. How are you today? Oh. Well, you know, the immigrant communities here, Greeks, Italians, aren't that because we're all immigrants. All right. It's 1,500 before prior because we had, so it's not like we're not using all Filipinos. That's right. You're right. You're right. So that's something I left out. That the United States passed a special act because so many Filipinos wanted to enlist and they couldn't. But the United States military passed an act that allowed them to do that. Yes.
I can bring copies, so you don't have to worry.
All right.
Get out if you want to. But
Hey, thanks for the sticks. We banged this morning.
our agenda for a week from Tuesday.
Hey, sorry.
If we have 3 of us, we have a quorum. But
No, it's
And then you're growing to like 6 inches tall. What do you do, Tristan?
people with
Music.
Didn't you get a lot of this a couple of years ago when you did all the photos?
Yes.
Vallejo has a way of making you feel like you care. All right, Tristan, good meeting you. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Christina, not Christina, not. And we know each other because my daughter, she worked with
I didn't sign my daughter. I kept on telling you, come. My office, you haven't come.